It was a charged morning at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The Grand Hall buzzed with delegates, security personnel, and reporters, all waiting for the next round of speeches. Tensions simmered beneath the diplomatic smiles as pressing global issues, climate change, food insecurity, and economic inequality, dominated the agenda. But what no one expected was that the most radical shift in tone would come not from a Western leader, but from a soft-spoken African president. If you believe in justice, faith, and people who change the world from the shadows, then the story of Ibrahim Traoré is one you can't miss. A leader without luxury, without a stage, only courage and a burning vision for Africa. This is a breathtaking journey, full of twists, revelations, and a truth that shook the world. Smash that like, share the truth, and subscribe now so you won't miss the next chapter in this revolution. Let's keep the spirit of African strength and self-reliance alive, together. When Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso approached the podium, some delegates barely glanced up. To many in the West, he was still seen as a young revolutionary with bold ideas but little influence. Behind closed doors, he had been mocked as the soldier boy president, and some officials from donor nations had even questioned whether he belonged at such a high-level event. Whispers of legal threats over trade disruptions and protocol violations from Western aid lobbies had surrounded his visit. Yet, when Traoré stood under the UN seal, dressed in his signature traditional attire with quiet confidence, the room slowly began to shift. "Ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the world," he began, his voice calm but unwavering. "I come not with a request for help, but with a new vision. A vision where African soil feeds African mouths. A vision where we do not just survive on the crumbs of foreign aid, but rise through the fruits of our own labor." A murmur passed through the assembly. "For decades," he continued, "our people have relied on programs like USAID. And yes, those programs have saved lives. But let us ask a harder question: has this aid truly freed us, or has it simply sustained our dependence? Have we mistaken the illusion of generosity for the absence of control?" The silence was immediate. All eyes were on him now. Traoré didn't flinch. He continued with startling clarity. "In Burkina Faso, we are launching an initiative called Rice for Everyone. With our own resources and the collaboration of regional partners, we will begin exporting rice to our neighboring West African countries. Not as charity, but as trade. This program will begin the phasing out of food dependency on external donors, including USAID." Gasps rippled across the room. Some applauded. Others stared, visibly unsettled. But Traoré pressed on, his voice rising with pride. "This is not merely about rice. It is about dignity. It is about redefining the African spirit. We want our children to grow up believing in the power of African unity, not just in the promises of foreign donors. We want to create new African money, not printed in Washington or Brussels, but grown, built, and circulated across Africa." He paused, and then delivered the line that would be replayed around the world. "External aid has a place, but it cannot be our destiny. True transformation begins when we take control of our future." And that is exactly what we are doing. The applause came in waves, first scattered, then rising to thunderous roars. But not everyone clapped. At the back of the hall, Donald Trump sat frozen. He hadn't expected to be shaken. But there was something about the speech, its clarity, its refusal to bow, that left even him speechless. "Who does this guy think he is?" he muttered, frowning. "Replacing U.S. programs like that?" Back at his private suite, Trump wasted no time. He summoned his advisors, pointing to a screen showing a replay of Traoré's speech. He wants to end USAID. He wants to tell America it's no longer needed. One aide spoke up, cautiously. "Mr. President, what he's proposing isn't an attack. It's about African self-reliance. They're trying to build internal capacity. This could change the continent's future. Trump didn't respond. For once, he had no snappy comeback. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, clearly disturbed, not just by what Traore said, but by how confidently he had said it. This wasn't just rhetoric. This was a challenge to the global order. In the days that followed, the world reacted. African youth flooded social media with the hashtag #NewAfricanMoney. In Dakar, students marched with banners reading, "Feed Africa with African Hands." In Lagos, a billboard went up with a quote from Traore's speech, "Dignity is not donated, it is built." And in Accra, a journalist wrote, "Burkina Faso has spoken, and Africa is finally listening." Meanwhile, Western newspapers scrambled to make sense of the moment. The New York Times headlined, "Traore's shock doctrine, can Africa say no to aid?" The Guardian called it, "the rise of a new African voice." But in Ouagadougou, President Traore kept his message simple. In a televised address back home, he looked directly into the camera and said, "We are no longer beggars at the banquet. We are builders of our own table." For a continent so often portrayed as broken, dependent, or helpless, the moment marked something far greater than policy. It marked a rebirth. A beginning. And for many watching, one truth had become undeniable: Africa was no longer waiting for permission to lead, it had already begun. The world watched with growing tension as Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. His speech, only minutes long, had already sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. But while much of the international audience praised his call for African self-reliance, one man was not pleased. Former U.S. President Donald Trump. Trump had taken personal offense to Traore's bold proposal to phase out food aid programs like USAID and replace them with a regional initiative led by Africans, for Africans. To him, Traore's words were not a declaration of independence but an open insult to the decades-long influence the United States had cultivated across the African continent. "This is an insult," Trump snapped, slamming a folder onto his desk during a closed-door meeting with his advisors. "We've helped these countries for years, and now they want to toss us aside. It's not going to happen. Not like this." Across the globe, headlines blazed with the news. Burkina Faso's leader challenges global order, one read. Ibrahim Traoré calls for African autonomy, said another. Television pundits debated the feasibility of his Rice for Everyone program, while development economists clashed over its merits. Some praised Traoré for having the courage to speak openly about the pitfalls of foreign dependence. Others warned that his goals were overly ambitious for a country like Burkina Faso, still grappling with underdeveloped infrastructure. Exporting rice sounds inspiring, one economist noted, but the logistics, land, irrigation, transportation networks, it's a massive undertaking. But Traoré remained unshaken. At a follow-up press conference, he addressed the criticism with firm composure. "Yes, we are aware of the risks. But no transformation ever began without courage. Our community farms are already producing more than ever. People are motivated because they see a future built by their own hands. We're not asking for permission. We are claiming our future." Back in New York, Trump decided to retaliate, not with diplomacy, but with a vow. He announced that the U.S. would increase its investments in food aid and infrastructure across Africa, attempting to reassert American influence. Yet his message fell flat among a growing number of African leaders, many of whom were quietly inspired by Traoré's conviction. For decades, they had balanced Western expectations with local realities. But now, someone had broken the silence, and the world was listening. When asked in an exclusive interview about Traoré's efforts, Trump scoffed. Does this guy really think he can do better than us? Good luck to him. Let's see how long it lasts without our help. But those words, intended as a dismissal, only fueled Traoré's momentum. To him, this wasn't a battle of egos. It was a battle for dignity. A battle against a system that had long undervalued African capability and spirit. In the weeks that followed, Traoré embarked on a regional tour. He visited Mali, Niger, and Côte d'Ivoire, speaking directly with farmers, university students, and political leaders. Everywhere he went, he repeated the same message: we are not just planting rice. We are planting hope. We are showing the world that Africa can eat alone. His message resonated deeply with young people, many of whom had never seen farming as anything more than hard labor. Now, with Traoré's leadership and investment in sustainable agricultural technology, a movement was taking root. Rural youth began forming agricultural cooperatives, receiving training and support from local experts instead of foreign contractors. Agriculture was no longer seen as a burden, it was now a form of resistance, of empowerment, of nation-building. In the eyes of many, Traoré had become more than a national figure, he was now a continental symbol. Under his guidance, Burkina Faso's rice production soared. Regional cooperation flourished. The initiative began to spread organically into neighboring countries. Governments offered land. Communities donated time and energy. And most importantly, the profits stayed local. No longer were African crops siphoned off by foreign multinationals. Instead, a new economic current began to flow, new African money, generated on African soil, managed by African hands. At a historic African Union summit, several heads of state stood and openly praised the impact of Traoré's Rice for Everyone program. He is proving, one president said, that African unity is not just a dream, it is a choice we can make every day. He reminds us that self-reliance is not only possible, it is necessary. By year's end, Burkina Faso had formed a powerful agricultural alliance with its neighbors. Shared storage systems, seed banks, and solar-powered irrigation stations were built across borders. New African money circulated through local markets and regional trade hubs. The dream of African unity, long buried under colonial scars and foreign debt, had begun to breathe again. And as for Traoré, he never claimed to have all the answers. But he had something far more powerful: belief. A belief in the people of Africa. In their potential. In their strength. And in the power of saying, at last, we will no longer be dependent. We will lead ourselves. We are tired of waiting. Tired of begging. It's time Africa feeds herself, declared a West African leader during a summit, his voice ringing with a determination that echoed across the continent. The room erupted in applause, not out of mere politeness, but with the thunder of a long-suppressed truth finally spoken aloud. Yet in another room, far from the African Union, former U.S. President Donald Trump stared at a screen with narrowed eyes. The growing influence of the Rice for Everyone program had become impossible to ignore. What began as an initiative in Burkina Faso under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré was now rapidly expanding across borders, drawing praise from leaders who had once hesitated to break with Western aid structures. To Trump, it looked less like innovation and more like rebellion. Evaluate this program, Trump ordered his team. Find out what it threatens, and how we take back control. But the more his advisors dug in, the more they encountered a wall of unity. African countries, many of which had once competed for donor approval, were now banding together in support of Traoré's vision. It wasn't just policy, it was pride. Traoré, meanwhile, knew that crops alone would not liberate a continent. Self-reliance required more than food, it needed knowledge, resilience, and vision. He launched a new phase of his movement, an initiative called Sowing the Future, dedicated to training thousands of young farmers in modern cultivation, resource management, and sustainable agricultural techniques. It wasn't just about planting rice, it was about planting leadership. During a visit to a farm in Mali, Traore met Amadou, a young man who had dropped out of school to help his family survive. "Mr. President," Amadou said, holding a bundle of rice with calloused hands and hopeful eyes, "because of this program, I can dream again. I can become someone." Traore smiled and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already are someone, Amadou. And you're proving something even greater. When we give our people the right tools, they can conquer the world." International media began to take notice. Environmental organizations praised the sustainability of the model. Humanitarian groups admired how the initiative restored dignity while reducing aid dependency. Even some former critics, once dismissive of Burkina Faso's capacity, started to walk back their doubts. But still, Trump remained skeptical. Eventually, driven by both curiosity and political instinct, Trump made an unexpected decision: he would visit Burkina Faso himself. Officially, it was a diplomatic gesture. But privately, it was a mission, to see what Traore was building, and whether it could be contained. When he arrived, Traore welcomed him with a quiet but meaningful ceremony. No fanfare, no grand stages, just farmers, students, and community leaders gathered under a mango tree. "Mr. President," Traore greeted, "I'm glad you're here. Let me show you what self-reliance looks like." They spent the day visiting farms run by young cooperatives, agricultural schools powered by solar energy, and local food hubs that distributed surplus rice to nearby towns. Trump walked through rows of golden crops, watching children measure pH levels in the soil, women tracking harvest data on mobile apps, and trucks loaded with rice headed for export, not import. "This is impressive," Trump finally admitted in a private moment. "But tell me, do you really think this replaces what we've done?" Traore's response was steady. "We are not replacing anyone. We are building something that belongs to us. Something that can inspire others, not divide them." Trump fell silent. For the first time, he wasn't facing a politician trying to gain favor, he was standing before a leader who didn't need it. A man who wasn't asking for help, but offering an example. What Traore had built had already begun to ripple far beyond Burkina Faso. Countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia were studying the model. Economists dubbed it New African Money, a term for internally generated capital rooted in land, people, and local innovation, rather than debt or dependency. Reports soon confirmed what many suspected: agricultural output across Burkina Faso and its partner nations had surged. Import reliance dropped. Local economies strengthened. Young people who had once dreamed of fleeing to Europe were now planting roots at home, proud to build something real. During a live interview weeks later, a journalist asked Trump a pointed question: "Now that you've seen the results firsthand, Mr. President, what's your opinion of the Rice for Everyone program?" Trump paused. A long, rare pause. He looked down, then straight into the camera. "Well," he said slowly, "it turns out this Traore guy, he might just be onto something." It wasn't an endorsement. But it was acknowledgement, from a man who rarely gave it. And across Africa, across a world often skeptical of its strength, the message rang loud and clear: Africa is no longer asking for permission. It is showing the world that with unity, vision, and leadership like Traore's, it can feed itself, finance itself, and define itself. A new chapter had begun. "I have to admit," Trump finally said during a televised interview, his tone more reflective than defiant, "this guy is doing something impressive. He's proving that it's possible to create local solutions to global problems. That's something we can all learn from." It was a sentence that stunned commentators across the political spectrum. For a man known for his blunt rhetoric and America First posture, Donald Trump's words were a rare show of humility. But more than that, they were proof of how far Ibrahim Traoré had come. What began as a bold rice initiative in a small West African country had evolved into a continent-wide movement, and now, it was shifting the narrative of Africa on the global stage. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré remained focused, grounded. The media buzz, the praise, the headlines, he acknowledged them, but they never distracted him from the bigger picture. He knew the path ahead was still long. But he also understood that the Rice for Everyone program had done something far greater than increase food production. It had planted a seed, of dignity, of unity, of belief. On the 5th anniversary of the program, a national ceremony was held under the open sky. Farmers, schoolchildren, elders, engineers, and international delegates gathered on a large communal field where golden rice waved in the wind like a sea of resilience. Taking the stage, Traoré looked over the crowd, some of whom had doubted him, many of whom had walked beside him, and began to speak. "When we started this journey," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "they said it was impossible. That we were dreaming too loud. That Africa could never feed itself. But here we are. Not just surviving, thriving. Together, we've proven that when Africans unite around a common vision, there is no limit to what we can achieve." Then, he paused and smiled warmly. "Amadou," he called. From the crowd, the young man who had once abandoned school to work the fields in Mali stepped forward. But this time, Amadou was no longer just a farmer, he was now a regional coordinator, overseeing agricultural cooperatives across multiple countries, mentoring hundreds of young farmers in sustainable practices. "Mr. President," Amadou said, his voice trembling with pride, "you gave me a future. But more than that, you gave me purpose. And now, I'm helping others find theirs." Traoré embraced him in front of the entire audience, a quiet but powerful moment that said more than any press release ever could. The applause that followed wasn't just for the leader, but for the journey, for the vision, and for every hand that had touched the soil to make it possible. "This," Traoré declared, turning back to the crowd, "is the real legacy. Not statistics. Not political wins. But lives transformed. Dreams fulfilled. This is new African money, wealth not stolen or borrowed, but grown by our own people, for our own people." The momentum only continued. Inspired by the project's undeniable success, several other African nations launched similar initiatives tailored to their local environments. Farmers from Ghana, Tanzania, Senegal, and beyond began collaborating, sharing knowledge, and investing in shared futures. Africa was no longer defined by dependence. It was writing a new definition, of strength, of sovereignty, of self-respect. Even outside the continent, global development experts began to shift their tone. What was once mocked as idealistic was now being called a model for the future. A grassroots movement of dignity-driven economics. A blueprint for post-aid prosperity. And then, something truly unexpected happened. In the quiet of a late evening, a handwritten letter arrived at the presidential residence in Ouagadougou. The signature was unmistakable. "Dear President Traoré, you've taught me something I didn't expect to learn. True greatness doesn't come from power or domination, but from building something real that lifts people up. Your leadership has shown the world what's possible when ideas are rooted in values and driven by courage. Congratulations on what you've achieved. The world needs more leaders like you. With respect, Donald J. Trump." The letter was published with Traoré's permission and quickly went viral. For many, it symbolized something deeper than political reconciliation. It marked a shift in how Africa was seen, and more importantly, how Africa saw itself. For Traoré, it wasn't a trophy. It was validation of a deeper truth, that when leaders stand for their people, when they trust in their own soil, in their own youth, in their own vision, they reshape the world. He stood one morning before a vast rice field stretching to the horizon, golden under the African sun. Birds soared overhead, and children played near irrigation channels they had helped dig. The scene was quiet, yet thunderous with meaning. Traore breathed in the scent of wet earth and whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." Because self-reliance was no longer a goal, it had become a reality. And with each grain harvested, each young farmer trained, and each border crossed in partnership rather than dependence, Africa was rising, not as a follower, but as a force. At first, the world misunderstood him. When Ibrahim Traoré, a young and defiant military officer turned president, stood before the United Nations and declared Africa's right to feed itself, many leaders rolled their eyes. His words were seen as naive, disruptive, even disrespectful. Some called his plans unrealistic. Others accused him of threatening global partnerships. Behind closed doors, international donors whispered about policy retaliation. Legal advisors debated whether his program might violate long-standing trade agreements. One Western diplomat reportedly muttered, "Who does this kid think he is?" Donald Trump, watching from a private suite in New York, reacted with particular disdain. "He's insulting the hand that feeds him," he barked to his team. "We've supported these countries for decades, and now they want to do it without us. This won't stand." It was a moment charged with misunderstanding and dismissal, but one that would soon be remembered as the moment everything began to change. Because what Traoré represented was not just a man, but a mindset. A turning tide. A rejection of a narrative that had for too long cast Africa as dependent, divided, and perpetually in need. The lesson begins here: never underestimate those who have been underestimated for too long. Traoré's Rice for Everyone program was more than an agricultural reform. It was an ideological revolution. It questioned the very foundation of foreign aid, asking, what if we stopped calling it help and started calling it control? What if we stopped depending and started building? His message wasn't angry, it was clear: Africa must feed itself, fund itself, and believe in itself. His declaration sparked immediate controversy but also sparked something deeper: hope. The first lesson is about courage. To lead a continent still recovering from colonial trauma, plagued by debt traps, and haunted by the shadow of conditional aid, and to say, "We will do it ourselves," is an act of immense bravery. Traoré didn't wait for permission. He didn't seek validation. He built. He planted. He mobilized. That is leadership. The second lesson is about the power of local solutions to global problems. Food insecurity is a global issue. But rather than relying on massive global supply chains and bureaucratic aid organizations, Traoré turned to the soil beneath his feet. He empowered farmers, not financiers. He prioritized cooperatives over corporations. He launched New African Money, not as a currency, but as an economic philosophy: wealth generated by Africans, circulating among Africans, benefiting Africans. This is not just economic reform. It is economic liberation. The third lesson is about the role of youth and education. Traoré knew that self-reliance is not inherited, it is learned. Through the Sowing the Future campaign, young farmers were trained in modern agriculture, climate-smart practices, and financial literacy. He didn't just give them tools, he gave them belief. One of those youths, Amadou, rose to become a regional leader in sustainable farming. His story is not unique. It is a symbol of what becomes possible when belief replaces pity. The fourth lesson is about unity. For too long, African nations have competed against each other for limited foreign attention and aid. Traoré flipped the script. He brought together Mali, Niger, Côte d'Ivoire, and others into an agricultural alliance built on trust and trade, not charity. Borders became bridges. This is African unity in action, not just spoken at summits, but lived in fields and marketplaces. And slowly, the world began to notice. Even Donald Trump, who once mocked the initiative, visited Burkina Faso and was forced to admit, "This is impressive." Eventually, in a letter to Traore, he wrote, "You taught me something important. True greatness comes from creating solutions that benefit people, not just governments." This brings us to the fifth and most powerful lesson: respect is earned not through imitation, but through authenticity. Traore didn't try to copy Western models. He didn't beg for inclusion. He offered a new way, one rooted in the African experience, in African land, and in African spirit. And by doing so, he didn't just change agriculture. He changed perception. He redefined Africa not as a crisis, but as a solution. Not as a burden, but as a blueprint. His leadership reminds us that self-reliance is not isolation. It is interdependence on one's own terms. It is the ability to collaborate, not out of desperation, but from a position of strength and dignity. It is the courage to say, "We welcome partnership, but we do not need rescue." In today's world, where aid often comes with hidden agendas, and power is too often measured by who controls whom, Traore offered a radical counterexample, a leader who empowered others not to follow him, but to follow themselves. The rice fields of Burkina Faso are more than farmland now. They are living classrooms. Each grain is a lesson in patience, resilience, and sovereignty. And each harvest echoes a truth the world had long ignored. Africa can lead. Africa can rise. Africa can feed itself. And the final, enduring lesson: dignity is not something you ask for. It is something you grow, row by row, seed by seed, until it becomes a field too vast to ignore.